Sorry, I thought you were talking to them.
Oh.
I was taking notes already. So what am I supposed to say? My name, Angie, and
What you're interested to learn.
okay. Someone posed a question at our last class, like, how do you start this? How do you, and I guess that, you know, in doing some of the readings and stuff that I did in preparation for this class, I feel like I got some background on that, especially with some of the stuff that, where you started in starting the process and keeping it moving too. So.
Hi, I'm Luke. I'm interested in community empowerment and restoration.
I'm Sean, and I don't know, I guess, yeah, I'm just interested to hear everything from your guys' perspective. I know we've read about it, and from everybody else's kind of perspectives, I'm just interested to hear kind of the more intricate details of everything.
Hello, I'm Tiffany. I am curious as to maybe your feelings about everything now looking back, and also just where the project has led to today.
I'm Maureen.
I'm Brian. I'm mostly interested in how you guys think it's going right now and the current status of restoration and everything in that sense.
My name's Nicole, and I'm also interested in sort of what your thoughts are on the situation now in that area, and just looking back on things that have happened over the past few years.
Hi, my name's John. I would like to hear a lot of maybe how you're applying this to other areas around the country, possibly other projects.
Hi, I'm Kimber. We had a question that was kind of collectively risen in our earlier discussion, which was how did it come about to pay, I think it's Crown Zellerbach, $30 million for the dams, when in many ways they were going to have to come, you know, something was going to have to be done either way. So was it kind of considered a settlement, or how was that seen and how was that decided upon? We're curious.
I'll be happy to tell you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Brian Young. I am, I guess, I'm tired of talking idealistically, and I'm ready to learn how to put plans into action. And also, I would like to know what you would do to improve upon your methods, seeing as you have accomplished. I mean, it's a great task that has been accomplished, and I'd just like to know, looking back, if there's anything you would have improved on for future actions such as this.
Hi, my name is Marty. Thanks for coming and talking to us. I'm interested in how the Elwha was like the first dam that I've ever heard of being taken down. I've always heard of the pros in terms of dams, never the cons, before the Elwha Dam example. And I'm also interested in if you guys know of any other sort of dams that would pose the same issues like that around Washington or the country.
My name is Lottie, and thank you for coming. We've seen the movie, we're ready to hear. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that intersection between community building and restoration, and where that process is at now.
Hi, I'm Jeremy, and I'm just interested in listening.
Hi, I'm Catherine, and I'm interested to know what sort of government organization needs to be involved in how, you know, like we read about the FERC and how regulations and everything. So in order to build a coalition, what parts of the government body do you need to get involved and talk with and negotiate and all that? And also, what, in your opinion, is the future of clean energy? Because, well, we have a lot of dams, and we count on a lot of dams. We have 75,000 dams. So what do you think is the future of clean energy, has the most potential, and could replace all these dams?
Hi, I'm Grace, and I'm interested in basically what everybody else said, but also, now let me quote you to yourself.
Yeah.
Because I underlined this quote and wrote, It's where you say, here I was talking about tearing out a dam. How irresponsible could you get? And I would say legally, there's a case for it, and it would do things for the park. Not only do you not have to be an attorney, you don't have to be a credentialed agency biologist to know a thing or two about this sort of thing, even when they tell you you're wrong. And I guess what gave you the confidence to like make those statements, even though you're not a lawyer or a credentialed agency biologist?
Okay. Well, I'm Rick Rutz, and this is Shawn Cantrell. We've worked on a number of different things over the years, and most satisfyingly, I think, was the Elwha. Is the Elwha. It's still not done. Well, let's see. So there's a lot of different things that are in your syllabus and that you're interested in, and of course, we're not going to have enough time to talk about all that in detail or even necessarily satisfyingly. We get together and we can spend more than an hour just telling, you know, crazy stories from when we did this. So, you know, formally, I have 3 degrees in zoology, bachelor's of science, master's of science, and doctorate. Shawn has a degree in political science and master's study, and we have many years worth of experience in working various issues for, principally for the environmental and conservation groups. I've got a little map up here which shows the Elwha. Let's see, maybe.
Yeah, it's kind of all or nothing with the lights, but that's
okay.
fine if you want to turn them out.
Let's leave them on. This is good enough. This is the Elwha watershed. You know, so it's Strait of Juan de Fuca is at the top, and I think the park boundary is about there. Height challenge, so the park boundary is about there, forest boundary is about here, and then private land and the reservation are further down the street.
Oh,
so the
laser. There you go.
So the upper dam is totally within the park. The lower dam is completely in private area, and I think a little bit of the reservoir did go on to Forest Service land, but I'm not even sure that was true. Anyway, this is where this thing is, and so, you know, how do you sort of get into this sort of thing? Well, let me talk a little bit, just a little bit about what hydropower actually is. So you have something in which to gather or divert water. So you could use just like effectively a hole in the bottom of the bathtub, and there are a couple of facilities like that. Or you can have a diversion weir, but usually you use a dam that spans a stream channel and totally controls the resource. And you take a bunch of water. In the past, they took it all and would dewater rivers. Now they try and take almost all of it, leave just a piddly little bit in there. And that's how we killed the wallop branch. But anyway, they divert the water and it goes into a power tunnel, which then connects to a pressurized pipe called a penstock. The penstock will go anywhere from about 50 feet to several miles. And generally what you're looking at is if you've got a smaller project, you're utilizing the topography to give you a height differential. And that height differential is energy, the amount that volume of water falls distance, and that gives you kinetic energy that you can use. If you've got a dam, you build up a big reservoir behind it, and the differential between the intake for that reservoir and where your powerhouse is gives you the change. So in both of these situations, we had big reservoirs, so the penstock wasn't very long. The powerhouse was located pretty near where the the dams work. So the penstock comes into the powerhouse, and so what that does is it goes through a turbine. And the turbine is just this little canister with a bunch of veins coming out, and wind vanes, or in this case water vanes. So the water comes in under pressure and it pushes this thing. And it's on an axle, so it turns. And that turns a drive shaft which goes up to the generator. The generator is a magnet which turns in a cage of wires. And that's the secret of it. It uses the Faraday effect. So what's a Faraday effect? Well, James Clerk Maxwell established that electricity and magnetism are two aspects of the same force. And what Faraday found was that if you spun a magnet in a cage of conductive material, you could get a flow of electrons. So you use all this goes to turn a magnet within this cage, and that generates a flow of electrons, which is your electricity. That's what this whole thing is all about. So knowing this, you know kind of the elements of the hydropower project, and particularly the new projects and how they're siting it. Understanding this helps you analyze what they're proposing to do. And in my experience, they rarely propose it to do it in a way that's both efficient and environmentally sensitive. They just kind of do it in a way that is cost effective, which means they do it as cheaply as possible and try and externalize as much as they can. And that's where the environment comes in. The environment has always been the place to externalize your costs. And that's where we come in. Because we care about the environment and we don't particularly like them externalizing costs of the environment. So now, hydropower. Back in the old days, they used to build these things for various sorts of reasons. Many of them were built as mill ponds to drive, a small grist mill. Most of the dams back east are of this sort. Around the end of the 19th century, technology advanced to the point where you were able to build larger dams that would reliably stand up for more than about 5 years before they fell down or get blown out. And the ability to capture the power from them increased. So people started building these things, and what the federal government came to assert its rights to the waters of the United States. Now, most of the powers of the United States are actually reserved for the states themselves, but the federal government reserves the rights for various sorts of things that, among other things, are involved in interstate commerce, which is how they retain control of the regulation of the rivers. So in the early 1900s was the period where the big fights for public power were starting to happen, where you had various sorts of bandit companies that were charging incredible amounts of money for people to get electrical output. And the people who were involved in the progressive movement of that time said, well, the ability for the public to get cost-effective power and not pay through the nose for it is something that we ought to be involved in and to help guarantee. And this fight went on for about 10 years or something of that sort, and it resulted in the Federal Power Act of 1920. And that act required that any non-federal agency who was going to build a dam on a river had to get a license for if it was going to generate power. That license was limited to no more than 50 years. And this was an intentional part of the act, since this was during the progressive era and the public power era. They had intended that at the end of 50 years, the the dam would be amortized, and they would have made a good bit of money, and then the public power utilities could capture those dams and would go into public power. And that was the original intent of the Federal Power Act. It set up the Federal Power Administration. In that period, Bonneville Power Administration was also set up during these public power battles. The rural electric cooperatives, bringing power to the rural countryside. That no private utility would pay the money, it would return it, so the government would do that and absorb the cost. So here you have some of the different elements that we were going to use. So coming now to more not really the modern era, because this is 50 years old. I'm 50 years old, so I'm not really part of the modern era in some ways. But anyway, so in like the 1970s, there began to be the concern about energy again. We had the energy crisis, and people were looking at alternative energy and how to make money at it. And small hydro became a big thing, and they passed the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act, PURPA, which said that public utilities had to buy from small developers for a rate that would allow them to make some money. And there became basically a gold rush on small hydro. So like the Snohomish Basin had 70 filings on it. Well, by this time, the Federal Power Administration had become the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. And there are many stories about FERC, none of which you'll hear today, but it's one of the great blackguard agencies that were out there. One of the people that we've worked with wrote an article for one of the law journals, was the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in Action and Inaction, which pretty much summarized the whole thing. Anyway, so I sort of got involved in hydropower because of this gold rush. There were just tens of projects being proposed everywhere, and this terrible agency really couldn't care less. And more than that, it worked really hard to keep people like me out. So that all my life, that's always been a sign that here's where something important needs to be done. If it's important enough for them to keep me out, it's important for me to be in there. So I got involved in that, and I started putting together position papers on cumulative impacts in hydropower, and testifying at their non-formal meetings, because they have regulations governing hearings, and they have to do certain things, but if they call it a meeting, then it's not covered by anything, and they can do anything they want, which includes taking the entire record and just throwing it into the wastebasket if they want to. Well, so that eventually went to court. The Tulalip tribe and others took them to court, and they won.
The tribe won.
The tribe won against the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But that got me started in working in hydropower. And working in hydropower was very difficult. Like I said, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, everything was designed to push projects through and to keep people out. You could file comments, you could file objections and various other terms, but all those things just went in the wastebasket. They didn't owe you anything. The only thing that mattered is if you intervened. That sounds legalistic, and it is. It was and is a quasi-judicial process, which means that it's not a law court. You don't have to be a lawyer to be in it. You can just be Joe Blow like me. But in fact, it has all the trappings of a legal process. You have to argue standing in a very legalistic sense. They have very very specific regulations, even to
Do you
how.
want to talk about standing just for a second? We read, do trees have standing, which is some
That's-
people read it as.
That's Justice Douglas, yes.
Yeah, so what that means in a.
Well, a simplified version of it is you have to prove that you would be materially affected by the decision that's going to happen. So, if you own property that would be affected, if you have a business that would be affected, if you have some other thing that would be affected, hopefully by money, but if not money, it's in a situation like this, it's generally very difficult for an individual to argue standing that they will recognize if they don't have money on the line. But a larger organization which pools a number of people, if that organization has been involved in it, if they've been conducting trips to it, if they've done educational things there, if they've been involved in it or they helped enact a park or something that would be affected, that organization, or if they've been involved in the proceedings before for whatever reason. It's a difficult process, and it takes some doing to do it correctly. And like I say, even this thing right here, the margins are a certain size, the typeface is a certain size. The way that I say things is done in a prescribed order and has certain things in it. All of those things have to be there, or they can throw this out without having any repercussions because I didn't follow the rules. And the rules are actually in the Code of Federal Regulations. So it's designed to keep people like you and me out. And part of how I got into this is that I'm technically trained and I know how to do this kind of thing. So this couldn't keep me out. So now we got a couple of things that came up. We had the Yakima Nation versus FERC, and we had the Tulalip decision. So the Tulalip decision was the first really major blow that FERC took. That the Ninth Circuit Court said they needed to be considering more for the environment, and that some of the things that they were doing were patently illegal and they couldn't do them anymore. And it made the FERC a little bit more afraid of the tribes, because the tribes had pushed this through. Then came the Rock Island decision, which is the Yakima Nation. This was a relicensing decision for the Rock Island Dam on the Columbia River. And FERC was just going to do a little environmental assessment, which is just a couple of pages saying, yeah, the dam is in there and there's not going to be any impacts from that. We'll go ahead. And the Yakima took them to court, and it went to the Ninth Circuit, and the Yakima won there, and it got appealed to the Supreme Court, which did hear it. And the Yakima prevailed in the Supreme Court as well. What the Supreme Court said is that, among other things, relicensing is not a pro forma sort of thing. Relicensing is a new decision. It's a major decision, because if you don't give that new license to them, then the dam has to come out. Because under the Federal Power Act, it has to have a license or it has to be removed. And so, and relicensing, just because it had a license, doesn't mean that's a pro forma decision. That's a new decision you have to make, and that's a major decision. And so for a major dam like the Rock Island, that decision has significant potential impacts, and EIS is necessary. Oh, this is a terrible thing for the FERC. And not only that, because the Supreme Court heard it, it was the law of the land everywhere. So, this is a strategic decision you have to make in lawsuits, is if you push it to a higher court and you lose, then the bad decision you don't like applies more broadly than the court you were in. So if you do it in district court, it's only technically for that district, although it's precedent. You do it for the Ninth Circuit, that's for the circuit, which is the West Coast. Yes.
When did the Yakima decision happen?
These are the early 80s. And I'm not a part of that, but I'm working with my friends in the tribes to provide where you could do friend of the court or go to hearings about these sorts of things. I would go. Because basically at that time I was the only one in the Northwest who understood this process and was getting involved in it. And that was to a large extent because it was a new issue and it was extremely complicated. And most people had to rely on an attorney, which I was not doing. And I had attorney friends who helped me, and one of them was Russ Bush with the tribes, and one of them was Lori Bodie with the Indians. Anyway, so we finally get to the Wilderness Act of 1984. So meanwhile, we're trying to get new wilderness areas, and you've got all these people running around trying to get all these small hydro projects and to ram them in. And a lot of these things are in areas that we want for wilderness. Well, if we allow these things to go through, they're going to build a road up there, build a dam and a powerhouse, and all that area plus wide swaths around it will be removed from our wilderness. We're going to lose 3/4 of our proposal before we even start if we don't stop some of these things. So that's where I really kind of kicked in to doing a lot of work. So I got involved in about 20 different projects, filing interventions against them. And that gave me legal standing. Once you're an intervener, you have the standing to file motions, to file comments which become official parts of the record. You are owed service of all documents by the proponent of the project. You owe service to them as well, being anything you file. And if you don't like something, you have the standing, having become an intervener, you have the standing to appeal to court. You're not an intervener, you have no standing for court, and they won't take you. So, we're kind of at this thing. I was working with Don Parks from the Bow Alps and Alpine Lakes Protection Society on timber supply analysis. And I won't go into those details, but while we were doing that for the Olympic Peninsula, I found that there was these 2 dams, and Don said we should have blown those up years ago. These things are just an abomination. There's one of them in the park. And I thought, what about relicensing? So I looked at that and I found that they came up for relicensing in 1975, which was like 8 years earlier. So if you're late, they won't allow you in except in extraordinary circumstances. And the extraordinary circumstances is how we got in. I'm going to have to move this along because I'm taking too much time on this. The 1920 Act, they also passed an act in 1921 that nobody remembered. And it was an act which said you couldn't license a project in a national park or national monument. And that was because they thought they'd done that in the 1920 Act, and then somebody made a filing, and it turned out they hadn't properly protected them, and so they passed this 1921 Act. And everybody promptly forgot about that for 50 years. I rediscovered it in doing my research. So here's another thing you do to help give you standing and help give you ammunition, shall we say, to utilize in battles against the people who are opposing you. So you have the 1920 Act, the 1921 Act, which says you can't license in a national park or monument, and you have the Rock Island decision, which says relicensing is like a new decision.
A new project, essentially.
Yes, it might be a relicense, but it's as if it were a new one.
Yeah.
Well, by the 1921 Act, you are not allowed to relicense in in the national park. The Olympic Park had been formed after the upper dam had been built, and it had not grandfathered it in. So I came up with this and said, we have a way to knock out the upper dam. It's illegal. Just by applying the law as it's written, the upper dam is illegal. And under the law, it has to come out. And the lower dam, without the protection of the upper one, and it's such a clunker anyway, and it's a safety hazard, which I had done my research on as well. And if you've read the stuff, you read some stuff about how it had blown out and they'd thrown a bunch of stuff in to fill it in. But they didn't even know what was in there. Right. So we say, this thing really isn't economical without the upper dam. So if we managed to get that one out, the lower dam, between mitigation and rehabilitation, they would basically have to rebuild the dam. So it wouldn't make any sense, so we can get them both out. Well, so, the idea is to try and get people interested in this. This is a crazy idea. And I'm not just saying this figuratively. Practically everybody I described this idea to said to me, Rick, you're crazy. This is insane. You're insane. You don't take out working dams that don't have something wrong with them. People are going to consider you to be a complete nut, and everybody associated with you is a complete nut. And we have a hard enough time as it is. People are calling us names, and you're going to be proving it to them. You're going to stay away. So
that was our friend.
That was our friend. And I'm not an attorney, so I usually had attorneys look over these interventions I put together. This is the one I wrote for the Elwha. And most of them that I had look at this say, you're crazy, this is a stupid idea and it's wrong. And some of them were nicer. They said, well, no one really knows what'll happen here, but this is too crazy to be real, give up on this. There were only a couple of them that said, this is a rather interesting idea, and the arguments are put together well, and I think you've got something here. No one knows in a legal thing until it's actually done whether it'll work, but you ought to try it. So several of the people who said that last thing to me, there weren't many of them, included the legal advisor for Seattle Audubon. And so I was able to get Seattle Audubon to come into this. Seattle Audubon had been running trips on the Olympic Peninsula since 1910. So there's the standing. And I got Friends of the Earth. They heard about it and they were onto it immediately. This is great. This is really out there, and we're for it. And they had a person in DC, David Conrad, who'd been working on this for years, and he was one of my very best contacts because he knew so much about the process, and we worked together all during this. And we got the Olympic Park Associates, and they liked the idea of restoring the Elwha drainage. And that gave standing too. And then we got the Sierra Club just by saying, basically, well, if you're not going to be part of this, we'll go and do it anyway. They don't like to be on the outside, so they came in just to protect their turf. Initially. Well, so we have the people together, we filed this thing. And it took the FERC about a year to decide what to do about the fact that people wanted to be part of this. I'd been going to some meetings before then. The companies had been meeting with the agencies and tribes 2 or 3 times a year to talk about the upcoming relicensing. But you see, they could get annual licenses from the FERC for like a couple of $1,000. They didn't have to do anything for them. So they've been sitting on their hands for 8 years because it costs more to relicense and do all the studies they needed to do than to just get the annual licenses. And so the agencies would go in there and they would ask for, they'd say, well, we want you to do this piddly little thing, and they'd say, yeah, no. So the agencies were asking for practically nothing, and they were getting stiffed by the companies. And I went to a meeting there and I said, we don't like what the agencies are asking for. We think you owe much more. In fact, we think the upper dam is illegal and we want it torn out. In fact, we want them both torn out. The guy said, who the hell are you? And I told him I was from these organizations. He says, you're not interveners. You have no businesses in this meeting. Get the hell out of here. And the agencies just sort of looked over to the side, or at their feet, or
The agencies meaning like National Park Service?
National Park Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, Washington Department of Game, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So
People
who should have had a standing.
Who are supposed to protect our natural resources.
Yeah.
I should say that at this point that if you're getting into this area, the agencies are almost never the innovators of new major things for the environment. The agencies are managers. And managers do best when things go along smoothly and nobody rocks the boat. You get your budget, you do the work in maintaining what you've got, and you try to do the best you can. And every once in a while you try and get a little bit of something, but particularly the people who are running them, they don't want surprises, they don't want bumps, they don't want controversy. So the agencies are not the innovators. The universities aren't the innovators. They get grants to do things, and if they don't have a grant, they don't do them. Certainly the privates aren't going to do that. They want to make money. And making money means running what they've got. So the ones who are going to accomplish something are the public. And in this circumstance, the public is the tribes and the environmental groups. So we've got, they're trying to kick me out, and the tribal member there says, I like what he's saying. He's here as my guest, and he can say what he wants with the tribe's blessing. Well, they weren't going to kick the tribe out, so I was there, and that was the first meeting where I was saying, we're going to rip these dams out. And at the end of the meeting, the tribal person and I got together and talked about what we wanted to accomplish. We want the same thing here. We need to talk more about this. But this is how the alliance between the tribes and the environmental groups started. It started right there with me shooting my mouth off.
And did the Elwha tribe know about the Yakima success at the Supreme Court? I mean, was that known amongst the Native American tribes?
The tribe's attorneys did.
Okay.
And possibly one or two of their technical staff, but Russ Bush, who was handling things for them in Seattle, plus one or two of the people more locally knew about that. All of the tribes, regularly shared information about what they were doing. In fact, so that they didn't get surprises, and their big victories in the Bolt and Oreck decisions wouldn't be threatened. This is how we got into it. Shopping the idea around and putting the intervention together and filing it. And because several of the agencies hadn't been part of the process, but had been working with going to these meetings for years, and the tribes, based on the reverses that the FERC had gotten with the tribes were certainly not going to be left out. But they weren't interveners yet, so that means they had to come in. So bringing new people in was not going to disrupt the process because we're going to have to do it anyway. And nothing had been accomplished in all those years because the company had just stiffed them. And so nothing would be, there was no slowing down of the process or retrograde motion because nothing had happened. So when it came time to let people in, they couldn't keep us out. The company tried to keep us out, but they couldn't. Well, so we got in, and that gave us standing, and from that point on, we went to all of the meetings, looked at all of the materials, and began to try and crank up attention for it and to build a public process. I think that I should let Shawn talk in here, because Shawn had a very large role, in fact, a major role for so many years in helping to steer this through. And even more importantly, Shawn was one of the major movers on the Condit Dam. And the Condit Dam, when you start thinking about what's the future here, how do we do these things in the future, the Condit Dam procedure actually gives better guidance for removal of projects now and in the future. So.
Yeah, and the Condit, actually, we watched the film, or the trailer for the film, The Art of the River, where they made a big deal about blowing it up. But anyway, people had lots of questions about that too, so feel free to touch on.
So Rick is a scientist, as evidenced by his detailed knowledge of all these things. I am not a scientist. I don't know crap. I come from a political background. I helped get people elected, was what I worked on for 5 years before I started working on the Elwha. I was a political science major, so I'm all about sort of policy wonky details and getting people elected, and grassroots organizing was sort of my background and interest. So as I became engaged in the Elwha issue, it had already been going on for 4.5, 5 years in a formal context. They'd already intervened and many things happened. So really my role was to try to take this wacko, crazy, insane idea and make it a mainstream idea. How do we get it from, you know, Rick and the 3 or 4 people in the environmental community that he persuaded to sign on to this intervention that he wrote, and the tribe who wanted those dams out from the second they were built, how to build out to a much broader group. And there was a whole lot of folks, I had a role in that, but there was a lot of people who built that. And it's standard grassroots organizing 101, where it's this concentric circles. You start with the people that are in the room, and it gets bigger and bigger. Rick and I were talking as we were driving down tonight, and we've talked about it before, is that, you know, today, 2 years after they started taking out the dams, 2.5 years, oh my God, everybody thinks it's a great idea. Yeah, everybody, I was there, and this was there, and and from elected officials to businesses to chambers of commerce, all think it was wonderful. But when Rick and the people started working on this, you could all fit in Rick's Hyundai. You know, that was everybody who thought this was a good idea fit in Rick's Hyundai. And so taking it from the Hyundai to the universe, who at least gives lip service to saying it's a great idea, was really a process of just concentric circles going out. Who do we know that might be interested in this? How do you build this out? And a lot of people doing it. So you get articles in the newsletter of all the enviro groups, and then you say, well, geez, the Kiwanis are always looking for someone to come talk, and we can show them pretty pictures of the Elwha, and they'll think it's a really stupid idea, but I'll go talk to them. And 1 or 2 people at the Kiwanis think it's an okay idea, maybe the Elks Club or the Moose or the Garden Club or whatnot. And so you do all those sorts of things, as well as, meanwhile, there's huge amounts of bureaucratic process and meetings, and people are going to that, and there's lawyers and there's biologists and engineers. So that all has to happen. But to change the public perception of this from, first off, knowing nothing about it, and then if they hear about it, oh, that's a stupid idea. Why would we tear out 2 perfectly good functioning dams that are giving us cheap, non-polluting energy? That was the perception. So you have to say, well, it's not really non-polluting. You know, sure, there's no air pollution, but you're actually changing the water temperature, and you're blocking the fish, and the sediment's coming down, and you have to get into tribal treaty rights, and there's huge numbers of things to talk about. But it's getting people to at least be willing to listen to you. And once they start listening, it was amazing how quickly people will go from stupid idea to, oh, that's cool. It's never gonna happen, but it's cool. Good luck with that. And then all of a sudden you have everybody in a room like this all saying, yeah, that's a good idea, good luck with that. I was like, well, if you write a letter, that was what I need. You know, we can get Congressman Al Swift to think, gee, maybe his constituents think this is an okay idea. And, you know, so it builds and builds and builds. So that's really what it took. Rick hit some key historical dates. I just mentioned a couple years of particular importance. 1978. Really important because that was the year that the Army Corps of Engineers, who had jurisdiction over dam safety across the country, did an analysis of dams all across the country, and they determined a handful, well, more than a handful, but a relatively small number of dams were unsafe. And if you've ever dealt with the Army Corps of Engineers, that is about as inflammatory language as they'll ever get. They're extremely bureaucratic, but for them to say a dam is unsafe is a huge, huge thing. And they said the Elwha Dam, the lower of the two dams, was unsafe. That because of the blowout and the crappy repair job they'd done, et cetera, that this dam was in danger of being blown out. So that happened in 1978. 1978 is also, as far as any research I can find, is the first time there was any public acknowledgement of saying, maybe we should tear out these dams. And it was a Seattle PI article written by then reporter, now semi-retired author, a guy named Bruce Brown. He wrote a book called Mountain in the Clouds. If you haven't read it, you should. But he worked for the PI at that time, and he wrote a story saying, we've got a huge problem with the fish on the Elwha getting decimated, and now we've got the safety problems. We can solve both of those by tearing out the dams. Didn't really go anywhere, but that was the beginning of that. Then it took people like Rick of, saying, well, yeah, this should be torn out, and say, well, what would it take? And doing all that. But that was in 1978. 1978, the third thing that happened that year that's really important is that was the year that FERC said, okay, we've got a license application to license the Elwha Dam. It was built before the Federal Power Act. It was built finished in 1914. Federal Power Act wasn't until 1920, so they didn't have a license. They didn't have to have one. They were quasi-grandfathered in, but there was sort of this legal gray area of whether or not they had to. So in 1968, what's that, 54 years after they first built it, they said, well, maybe we'll apply for a license now for the lower dam. And in 1973, the dam owner, Crown Zellerbeck, said, well, we got our license for the upper dam, Glines Canyon, is going to expire we got a 50-year license, and it will expire in 1976. So in 1973, they started the licensing proceeding, because these things take a long time, even if they do them in time, which obviously they hadn't, as Rick mentioned. But so in 73, there was an application. Well, 1978 is when FERC said, okay, there's these two different license applications. We haven't really been doing much on either of them, but these two dams are really engineering-wise, electrical transmission system, hydraulically are so interconnected, we're going to consider them as one application. So that was really huge, because then when you start talking about, well, the upper dam is illegal and it can't get relicensed, and the license proceeding is really looking at the two together, and the lower one is unsafe, and so we may have to get it out while the two dams are linked, that linkage of those two by FERC was really important. So that was 1978. 1986 was a huge year, also important, because that was the year that first the tribe, and then followed by the 4 conservation groups within a couple weeks or months, formally filed their intervention motions for the Elwha projects, and specifically called for dam removal. Lots of other people had intervened. The federal agencies were involved, state agencies were involved, and they said, yeah, we have an interest in this. Their interest wasn't dam removal, but they had an interest in it. These were the first filings in a formal way saying, we want to be involved in this decision, and we tell you what our opinion is that the dam should be coming out. So those 4 environmental groups and the tribes in 1986 said that. Other key thing in 1986 is Congress updated the Federal Power Act. Again, it had passed in 1920. There was that addition in 21, or that correction that Rick mentioned. Well, in 1986, they significantly changed the Federal Power Act. There's something called ECPA, ECPA, the Energy Consumer Protection Act, I think.
Electric Consumers Protection Act.
Yes. And basically what Congress tried to do in 1986 was rebalance the Federal Power Act. When it was written before, it was all about trying to promote the development of hydropower. That's really promote and regulate, but really it was a promoting this. We want more hydropower. This is what the 1920 Act. 1986, they were still promoting electrical power, but it was really, as the framers of the act said, was to try to rebalance it so that it gave equal consideration to non-power purposes. So fish, wildlife, tribe, a whole variety of things, and you can go back and look at that. But that all of a sudden took that FERC's mandate, according to the law, which is licensed projects. I mean, Rick implied this, I'll say it point blank. FERC never met a project that they didn't like. They wanted to license any project. It had to be so horrible, or that somebody had a bigger dam upstream or downstream that they wanted to build, that this would mess up. But that was the only way they were going to say no to a hydro project, is if, you know, it was just because somebody had a bigger, more damaging project that they wanted to propose. So this was an attempt to provide some balance. Again, FERC still had huge preference for power generation and licensing or relicensing it, but the ECPA really attempted to bring a number of factors, including fish and wildlife, into more equal standing with power. So that was also in '86.
And we got this because of the environmental groups. The environmental groups had never been able to get the Federal Power Act amended to get any consideration of environment into it. We simply didn't have anywhere near the votes to it. But this act, which is called the Electric Consumers Protection Act, that's one of the great euphemisms. It was really the private utilities companies' bailout act. And what it was is that the relicensing I talked to you about, the idea was that they were going to recapture. Well, 50 years later, the private utilities didn't like that. They wanted to keep their dams. And what set it all off was the Merwin Dam situation, where one of the PUDs in southwest Washington attempted to recapture. And all the private utilities went crazy and were running around. All their lobbyists made it their big thing to get a change to the act. But they didn't have enough votes. They were shy. The public utilities, which wanted to recapture, they didn't have enough votes to put, you know, a stake in the heart of this beast. So we ended up with the people who supported us having the balance of power. And we said, we want changes to the Federal Power Act that is going to make environment much more important. And interestingly enough, the private utilities were the ones who were willing to do it. The public utilities, we're public utilities, we're in the public good. And we looked at them and said, you build big nasty dams and you treat the environment like garbage. You're no better than they are. We want these changes, and they weren't willing to do it. So we backed the private utilities. So they got an end to the preference for public utilities in relicensing, which is arguably not all that great a thing. But the real gain was the environmental provisions in the Power Act. And this was high-level power politics we had to play in order to get a change to that act.
So, recognizing we're almost out of time,
Yeah.
two last dates that I'll mention that were key on this. 1990, a number of things happened, but this is where FERC, Rick talked about the Rock Island Dam decision at the court, where basically said you can't just do an environmental assessment, you gotta do a relicensing, not in all cases, but on big dams or big decisions, you have to do a full environmental impact statement. So FERC started doing their EIS for the Elwha projects in 1990. They'd done some scoping work, etc., but 1990 is really where they said, we will do an EIS as opposed to an EA, and you saw a big change where all of a sudden, not quite, all of a sudden implies that it just happened magically. There was a lot of work by a lot of people, But once that was happening in 1990, you also had the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, the three main resource agencies that are protecting fish and wildlife in theory, and the nat and environment came out and said, we want to see the Elwha dams removed. So instead of just the tribes and those crazy environmentalists out here calling for this, you now had federal agencies. And again, most of you in this room are too young to remember this, but in 1990, it was George Bush, the senior, was president. He had some very unenvironmentally friendly people running things like the Interior Department, a guy named Mounty Lujan. And environment was not a high priority, nor were they particularly friendly towards it. So when the state or the regional offices of these federal agencies say, yeah, we want to come out in favor of dam removal, that was huge. And those people got in trouble, but they didn't have their decision reversed. That it caused all kinds of waves back in DC, but that decision to say we support dam removal, we don't support relicensing these projects stuck. So that was huge. There was a number of other things, but also by 1990 you saw the Seattle Times and Cairo TV. You guys probably don't remember this, but TV stations used to have editorials where somebody would come on and say, here's the position, just like an editorial page in the newspaper. TV stations long ago used to do that. So you had Cairo TV and the Seattle Times, and the PI had already done it, and the Tacoma News Tribune started editorializing, saying dam removal on the Elwha is the right thing to do. So from this wacko extreme fringe idea, it had now gained relatively mainstream acceptance. Didn't mean that everybody thought it was a great idea, but it wasn't just an extremist idea. The last date that I had mentioned, there's lots of other dates and times that we can always talk about, but 1992, because that was the year when Congress finally passed the Elwha Act. I started working on this project in late 90, really in 91 is where I was more involved, and in 92. And for all of 91 and 92, almost all of my time was spent trying to get a good bill passed by Congress, because there was all kinds of ideas that say, oh yeah, we'll pass legislation and it will ensure that those dams never come out. That will basically just forgive all of this past mess, or we'll give them a special permission to have a dam, because Congress can change the Federal Power Act. And so if the law says you can't license a dam or relicense a dam in a national park, then we'll just go in and we'll just change that and say, oh, yeah, you can't do that except for on the Elwha River. You know, and so there were those sorts of proposals.
That you were like seeing it happen.
Yeah, I mean, and again, there was a lot of people, but that's what I spent a lot of time doing. I think, Kimber, your name is, you asked about why $29.5 million, which is the amount, to pay Daishoa and James River for the privilege of taking their dams out for them. And that's purely political. You know, there was calculations of the net value of how much electricity the dams would have generated over a 50-year license and all this, but at the end of the day, it was a payoff. Get them to accept not having these licensed. Why did we go along with that? If we thought we had a good case to say, yeah, you can't license these dams, and that you have this dam that's illegal, so take it out, you should pay for it, which is what we've done in other places like Condon Dam. Why did we accept this idea that not only does Daishoa and James River don't have to pay for removal, we're going to pay them for the privilege of buying their deadbeat dam? And the fact is that there was a number of issues that made it highly questionable of whether or not we could have actually successfully gotten the dam owners to pay for dam removal. That the dam owners had really good lawyers who had figured out that, well, geez, these dams are a potential really big, ugly liability. So what should we do? Let's sell these to a subsidiary. So they created, the owner of the dams was a company called, at this time, called James River. And they created a wholly owned subsidiary, but a separate company called James River 2. And the entire assets of James River 2 was the Elwha and Glines Canyon Dam. So if we had the owner had to pay for dam removal, we'd have to go to James River 2 and say, okay, we need you to pay for removal. And they said, well, the only assets we have to pay for it with is the dams themselves. Oh, well, we'll declare bankruptcy and walk away.
Oh my God.
It was an extremely bitter pill.
Out there as
Yes.
a potential.
Yes, so it was an extremely bitter pill to say we're going to let them off the hook and not have them pay to clean up their mess. But the reality was that it was probably going to fall on the taxpayers anyway, and we thought it would make the whole process go a lot quicker. I'm not so sure if somebody was asking what would we do different or if we go back. I think those would be some areas where I would seriously look at how to do some things differently so that the Elwha Act passed in 1992 and dam removal didn't start until 19 years later. What could we have done to speed that up? One of them would have been defeated Slade Gordon much earlier than we did, because he was a single-handedly added 10 years to this project by fighting it. But there's a number of things that we could have done differently, but on that, $29.5 million was basically to get James River to not fight this and drag it out, to get them to go along in court. Once they saw that they were going to get buyout, they were amazingly, wonderfully helpful in working on it. Yeah, I mean, they had two lobbyists, one of whom I really liked personally, but I had no personal trust in him and doing anything that would not stab me in the back. And the other one I found was the most slimy, smarmy lobbyist that fit every stereotype, but his interests aligned with ours. So had to work with both of those guys and celebrate and have parties and congratulations and all of these things afterwards. But it was just a real eye-opening process to see how DC can work.
So one of the big differences between Elwha and other things was that, well, this being first, and no one, people still thought it was a crazy idea, and there were a lot of political considerations. So effectively, the political leaders of Washington, the senators and representatives, said this isn't going to happen if you try and force the companies to do it. If you go to court about that, we'll pass the law which says it's legal. So it was either go along with this and the public pays for it, or it's not going to happen. Well, in practical politics, you sometimes have to make those decisions. In fact, most of the time you do. You have a wilderness proposal and they say, okay, we've met together and the most we can do is 70% of it. Well, do you say all or nothing? You go for the 70%. If you can't get the 100, then you're going to have to settle, and there's going to be some things you're going to lose. Now, the Condit Dam, which Shawn had such a major role in accomplishing, he and Catherine Ransel basically masterminded that one. We had the negative of not having the Federal Power Act, the relicensing, being illegal in the national park. We didn't have that hook. But what we did have was the Power Act amendments that Shawn talked about, the ECPA, which significantly strengthened our hand against the Condit Dam on the White Salmon River. Also, there was legislation that had been passed which said the river was a candidate for wild and scenic status. And knocking off a dam from that would be really good for that sort of thing. But the fact of the matter was that the Elwha Dam moved things along, and what was unthinkable and insane, in fact, when FERC was first thinking of doing the environmental work, they weren't even going to consider dam removal. It was an alternative that was eliminated from further consideration. The reason that they considered it and it became a main alternative was that we threatened a lawsuit. We said, we have our position here, we're parties to this, and we've got agencies who have said this is the best way to accomplish fish restoration. This damn well better be possible. Dams don't live forever. At some point, it's gonna have to come out. It's patently absurd to say that it's a ridiculous alternative. So we'll take you to court, and then they decided to actually make that a main alternative. And when it was finished, it showed that taking the dams out actually cost less money than anything else. To mitigate at, not nearly as good a return would cost more money than to rip the dams out and have full restoration of all the